Okay, we are going live. We're going live a little bit earlier than we expected to. Also, maybe a little bit later than we planned on. So let me just send a few links and we will go live and we'll cover what we've missed. And we'll be starting in just a moment. We're now live. I'm going to send this post out. And today's a really good day to join for the first time, if this is your first time joining, because we're going to briefly cover what it is we've covered before, and then we're going to jump into it. So this is the Year 1 Philosophy of Religion course, and this is the first section. And in this section, let me know if you're here, if you can't hear me, but I think I'm audible. So in this first section of the Philosophy of Religion, what we're covering is philosophy and religious belief. Is there a conflict between faith and reason? Before we get into the attributes of God, arguments for and against his existence, ethical concerns, the problem of evil, all that stuff that we'll be getting into, we first have to say, now, wait a minute, hold on a second. Philosophers care about reason and they care about arguments. And isn't this faith thing, different than that? Is it a different game? Is it a contradictory game? Is it an incompatible way of thinking? So is faith an affront to reason? How can you rectify the two? Does reason support faith? If a doctrine is unreasonable, is it a good religion which requires belief in it anyway? Or should you have reason guiding all of your religious beliefs? This is obviously a problem for philosophers, right? They want to be reasonable. That's their game. Is faith positively immoral no matter in what it is placed? We've heard articles on that, which we'll talk about. That just the mere fact that you're not only believing things based in reason is itself an indictment. If there is a God, is he the God of reason? In other words, will reasons inevitably support the true religion? And if you have beliefs in your religion that are unreasonable, maybe can you take that as a sign that your faith is in error in some way? Or is there a divine principle that's above that? How do we set these? Or is faith prior to reason? Does reason need to be grounded in something? And is the proper role for faith to be the thing that makes it possible to be reasonable in the first place, right? So we're going to read a lot of essays in this first section on these types of questions before we jump into the rest of the philosophy of religion. So the first article we read was by St. Thomas Aquinas, and we'll have opportunity in year 2 to spend a lot more time looking at him. His view is that it's proper that God would give us revelation of truth that we need for salvation and for life. But it's also proper that some of the truths that we need could be gotten to by us through reason alone as well. So he sets out to do philosophy and discover that some, but not all of the important truths that you can get through revelation from his view are not contradicted by what reason tells him, and that if you do philosophy properly, it will be good for your faith. That's his view. Then we read an article by W.K. Clifford. I beg to differ, he says. If you wish to follow reason, you will find that faith by definition is immoral. Faith is the willingness to believe without good evidence. There's nothing righteous about such an action or attitude, and it corrupts the soul of those who engage in it and makes them less ethical and less trustworthy members of society. Faith cannot coexist with reason. It is unreasonable from the start. Now, most atheists aren't that extreme in their view, but we got to read a pretty well-defended and well-put article by him making this case. Then we read Anthony Flew, his response. So I wouldn't go that far. Belief in religious doctrine requires evidence or the support of good reasons for us to be philosophical in adopting it. So Anthony Flew's view is, look, we need reasons to believe in religious truths. Let's have it out. Let's argue it in the realm of philosophy. And if you can convince us, we should believe. And if you can't, well, then we'll withhold belief and we'll presume atheism until convinced. That was his argument. St. Thomas Aquinas was right that is what the religious ought to do if they expect us to believe, he says. But first, he says, I think they could do it, right? Maybe they can. Let's be open-minded. Let's have an open court here and hear their arguments. And if they do, we should be convinced by them. They have two burdens. First, they must present to us an idea of God which is itself reasonable, a God which could be real. And then it's their burden to show us that that God is actually real. And if they can meet both of those tests, we should be convinced. Now, he was an atheist when he wrote this, and he became a believer of a sort by the time he ended his life. So he was honest about all of this. He really meant it. He said, look, I just need to be convinced, and we should have it out in reason, but it would be unreasonable for us to just go around believing things until we have good reasons. This is something that the religious could do, and until they do it, it's our duty to remain unbelieving, to presume atheism. A weak form of atheism is what he was advocating. Not certain of atheism, but presuming it as a strong point from which we should be, a starting point, I mean, from which we should be successfully argued. Now, we've just started reading Alvin Plantinga, and it's a quite long essay. So we only got to read the beginning of it. But Alvin is going to come in and say, actually, I think Thomas Aquinas was wrong. I think Clifford was wrong. I think that Anthony Flew was wrong. I don't think faith propositions are the sorts of things that need to be reasoned to. I think they're what he calls properly basic. Okay? They make reasoning possible. They're what you start with. Okay? So what we're going to do today is pick up where we left off. We only got to read the beginning. Oh, let me turn this light on. We read quite a lot of his article last time, but we still only barely got into it. It's a very, very long read. So let's rehearse quickly what it was that he covered, actually. Oh, I shouldn't remove it. Let's add this here. Okay. He says, everyone's making the same mistake, the mistake that faith needs to be supported by reason. Faith is properly basic. It is not something which needs to be argued to. It is something which allows us to, okay, we just said all that. So what he's done in the beginning part here is he set the stage, and he said, the way I got to this belief, so he hasn't proven it yet, but he's going to try to prove in this paper that faith is what he calls properly basic. It is not unreasonable to believe in it without good support, because something has to be foundational. Something has to be that upon which we build the rest of what we know. And he said, the way I got there was through three threads of thinking. I was thinking about Thomas Aquinas, and I was thinking about what I thought was wrong about his view. And I was thinking about the evidentialist objection to belief in God and what I thought was wrong about that. And I was thinking about, what was his third thread here? Hold on. He had a third stream of thought. And he says they all came together for him to develop this idea that he's going to try to demonstrate here, which I think is called reform epistemology. He's basically saying something like the Calvinist idea was this, but they didn't put it clearly enough, and let me flush it out for you. And I think this is, he thinks he's correct in saying that religious belief is properly basic. In other words, it's not irrational to believe it as the starting point. So what he's done so far that we've read is here's where we left off, is he's looked at the evidentialist objection, and he made a quite interesting move here. He says, okay, let's look at Anthony Flew's presumption of atheism, he says. He quotes Flew. He says, the word atheism, yeah, we know what he says. Okay. Continuous suggestion, debate of God. Right. Here we have a claim much more contentious than the mere suggestion that a debate about the existence of God ought not to start from the assumption that indeed there is such a person. Here Flew is claiming that it is irrational or unreasonable to accept theistic belief in the absence of argument or evidence for the existence of God. All right, so here's what he came up with. It's quite an interesting move. He says, now, wait a minute. It's unreasonable to take a proposition like God exists and incorporate it into your worldview if it conflicts with the other things you already believe. If it's not reasonable and you can't make sense of it, if you don't have good reasons to incorporate it. He says, now, wait a minute. That's true if your other beliefs don't include the proposition that God exists already from the starting point. If it's true that belief in God is a thing we have to argue to, then yes, it would be unreasonable to believe in contradictions or believe things that don't make that we, to lie and pretend we believe one thing but believe its opposite. That would be unreasonable. But if it's already in there because it belongs in there as a thing that makes it possible to start pursuing truth, if it's properly basic, then that's the only hole that's left in that argument. I think that is actually the case. So you can watch the last video first to do that better and to get more in depth into it. But here, let's pick up where we left off. M. Scriven, atheism is obligatory in the absence of evidence, he says. Okay. According to Michael Scriven, if the arguments for God's existence fail, then the only rational posture is not merely not believing in God, it is atheism, the belief that there is no God. Speaking of the theistic proofs, he says, it will now be shown that if they fail, there is no alternative to atheism. He goes on to say, we need not have a proof that God does not exist in order to justify atheism. Atheism is obligatory in the absence of any evidence for God's existence. The proper alternative, where there is no evidence, is not mere suspension of belief, example, Santa Claus, it is disbelief. So he's quoting Scriven there, and he says, but Scriven's claim seems totally arbitrary. He holds that if arguments for God's existence fail and the arguments against God's existence also fail, then atheism is rationally obligatory. If you have no evidence for the existence of God, then you are rationally... Oh, we did read this before, did we? Yes, we did read this. So this is quite an interesting intellectual move he made. Listen to the thought process that we talked about last time. It's quite interesting. He says, take the proposition God exists and take the proposition God does not exist. Oh, no. Let's move back. I'm so sorry. Let's move back to... I was wrong. We hadn't read this yet. Okay, here's the argument. Imagine someone were to make the argument, Fike is a Frisian lifeguard. Oh, I'm sorry. Take the proposition, Frike is a Frisian, and 9 out of 10 Frisians cannot swim. It would be unreasonable to assume that Frike or Fike can swim. Right? He says, okay, from what we know, it's unreasonable to believe in God given the presence of evil, say, right? It's not likely that an all-good, all-powerful God exists with evil. Sure, it's unreasonable to believe in God, unless there's other propositions that could also be true that would make it very reasonable, he says. That's not enough to know there is no God or to think it's unreasonable to believe in God. He says, what if the next proposition is Fike is a Frisian lifeguard and 99 out of 100 Frisian lifeguards can swim? That could have been true. That doesn't contradict the first statement that 9 out of 10 Frisians cannot swim. And he's Frisian, right? So what he's saying is, it's quite an interesting logical move that he's pointing out here, right? There's other things we could know. We still have to go and investigate. It's not enough that we have one reason to think it's unlikely. So in any event, let's see what he does similarly with Michael Scriven here. Arguments for God's existence fail, and the argument against God's existence fails. Also, that fails. So then atheism is rationally obligatory? That seems arbitrary. If you have no evidence for the existence of God, then you are rationally obliged to believe there is no God, whether or not you have any evidence against the existence of God. The first thing to note then is that Scriven is not treating God exists and God does not exist in the same way. He claims that there is no evidence for A, then the only rational course is to believe it's denial, B. But, of course, he does not propose the same treatment for B. He does not suggest that if there is no evidence that God does not exist, then he is rationally obliged to believe in the denial that God does not exist. In other words, to believe that God does exist. If he did propose that 9 should be treated like A, then he would be committed to supposing that if we had no evidence either way, the rational thing would be to believe the denial of the idea that God exists and also the denial of the idea that God does not exist. Why then does he propose the lack of parity between the two statements, God exists and God does not exist? What is the justification for treating these propositions so differently? Could not the theist just as sensibly say, if the argument for atheism fail, and there is no evidence for the proposition that God does not exist, then theism is rationally obligatory? Scriven's claim, initially at any rate, looks like a piece of merely arbitrary intellectual imperialism. Scriven's extravagant claim, then, does not look at all promising. Let us therefore return to the more moderate evidentialist position encapsulated by the following proposition. It is irrational or unreasonable to accept theistic belief in the absence of sufficient evidence or reasons. And there is no evidence, or at any rate, not sufficient evidence for the proposition that God exists. Right? Let's go back to them because that seems more reasonable, he says. Okay. The evidentialist section 3, the evidentialist objection and intellectual obligation. Now, Proposition 7, that there's not sufficient evidence for the existence of God, is a pretty strong claim. What about the various arguments that have been proposed for the existence of God? The traditional cosmological and teleological arguments, for example. What about the versions of the moral argument that the moral argument has developed, for example, by A.E. Taylor, and more recently by Robert Adams? What about the broadly inductive and probabilistic arguments developed by F.R. Tennant, C.S. Lewis, E.L. Maskell, Basil Mitchell, Richard Swinburne, and others? What about the ontological argument and its contemporary versions? We'll have a lot of time to look at all of those later. I don't think he's going to side with these, by the way. I think he's trying to say it's basic. It doesn't require arguments. Arguments won't work for it, but let's see what he says. Do none of these provide evidence? Notice the question is not whether these arguments taken singly or in combinations constitute proofs of God's existence. No doubt they do not. The question is only whether someone might be rationally justified in believing in the existence of God on the basis of the alleged evidence offered by them. And that's a radically different question. Right? So he's saying, he's only sticking to the question, is it irrational to believe in God philosophically? That's all he wants to know. He's not even saying, I'm saying God does exist, which I think he will in other places maybe. But what he's saying is, is it anti-philosophical to believe in God? That's what's on trial here for him. Okay. At present, however, I am interested in the objector's other premise, the claim that it is irrational or unreasonable to accept theistic beliefs in the absence of evidence or reasons. So that's where he wants to attack. Why suppose that is true? Why should we think a theist must have evidence or reason to think that there is evidence if he is not to be irrational? Why not suppose instead that he is entirely within his epistemic rights in believing in God's existence, even if he has no argument or evidence at all? This is what I want to investigate. Suppose we begin by asking what the objector means by describing a belief as irrational. What is the force of his claim that theistic belief is irrational, and how is that to be understood? The first thing to see is that this objection is rooted in a normative view. It lays down conditions that must be met by anyone whose system of beliefs is rational. And here, rational is taken as a normative or evaluative term. According to the objector, there is a right way and a wrong way with respect to belief. People have responsibilities, duties, and obligations with respect to their believings, just as with respect to their actions. Or if we think believings are a kind of action, they're other actions. Professor Brand Blanchard puts this clearly. Everywhere and always, belief has an ethical aspect, he says. There is such a thing as a general ethics of the intellect. The main principle is that of that ethic I hold to be the same inside and outside religion. This principle is simple and sweeping. Equate your assent to the evidence. And according to Michael Scriven. Now, even belief in something for which there is no evidence, this is all a quote, i.e. a belief which goes beyond the evidence, although a lesser sin than belief in something which is contrary to well-established laws, is plainly irrational in that it simply amounts to attaching belief where it is not justified. So the proper alternative, when there is no evidence, is not mere suspension of belief, example about Santa Claus, it is disbelief. It most certainly is not faith. Perhaps this sort of obligation is really just, we continue with the unquoted parts, with the essay we're reading, just a special case of a more general moral obligation. Perhaps it is, but perhaps on the other hand, it is unique and sui generis. In any event, says the objector, there are such obligations. To conform to them is to be rational, and to go against them to be irrational, right? So he's setting up the case of the other side, and he's saying, I think I've got it. What they're saying is, maybe this applies to everything. I'm not sure. I'm suspicious that you don't really use the standard for everything, but maybe it does apply here especially, or maybe it does apply to everything. But you have this idea that it's irrational to believe things without evidence, even if there's no evidence that they're wrong. And I'm not sure that's always the case. And I want to figure out when it could be rational that wouldn't be the case. So let's see. Now here, what the objector says seems plausible. There do seem to be duties and obligations with respect to belief, or at any rate in the general neighborhood of belief. One's own welfare and that of others sometimes depends on what one believes. This was the essay we read earlier, right? If we are descending the Grand Teton, and I am setting the anchor for the 120-foot rappel into the upper saddle, I have an obligation to form such beliefs as this anchor point is solid only after careful scrutiny and testing. One, commissioned to gather intelligence, the spies Joshua sent into Canaan, for example, has an obligation to get it right. I have an obligation with respect to the belief that Justin Martyr was a Greek apologist, an obligation arising from the fact that I teach medieval philosophy, must make a declaration on this issue, and am obliged not to mislead my students here. The precise nature of these obligations may be hard to specify. What exactly is my obligation here? Am I obliged to believe that Justin Martyr was a Greek apologist if and only if Justin Martyr was a Greek apologist? Or to form a belief on this topic only after the appropriate amount of checking and investigating? Or maybe just to tell the students the truth about it, whatever I myself believe in the privacy of my own study? Or to tell them what is generally thought by those who should know? In the Rappel case, do I have a duty to believe that the anchor point is solid if and only if it is? Or only if it is? Or just to check carefully before forming the belief? Or perhaps there is no obligation to believe at all, but instead an obligation to act on a certain belief only after appropriate investigation. In any event, it seems plausible to hold that there are obligations and norms with respect to belief, and I do not intend to contest this assumption. He agrees. He agrees with Clifford in general. It's like, yeah, of course, obviously, it's immoral to just go around believing whatever makes you feel good. People's lives could be at stake sometimes. Sure. It's a general rule. Are there exceptions? Now, perhaps the evidentialist objector thinks that there are intellectual objections of the following sorts. With respect to certain kinds of propositions, perhaps I have a duty not to believe them unless I have evidence for them. Perhaps I have a duty not to accept the denial of an apparently self-evident proposition unless I can see that it conflicts with other propositions that seem self-evident. Perhaps I have a duty to accept such a proposition as I see a tree under certain conditions that are hard to spell out in detail, but include at least my entertaining that proposition and my having a certain characteristic sort of visual experience, along with no reason to think my perceptual apparatus is malfunctioning. Okay, now wait a minute. I think he's going to hinge a lot on this. I see a tree. I believe there is a tree there. Do I need an argument for that? Is it proper for me to just accept the evidence of my eyes without investigating much further? There's different kinds of propositions, and the test of what proper evidence is necessary to support them is going to be different. That's all he's establishing so far. Of course, these obligations would be prima facie obligations. In special sorts of circumstances, they could be overridden by other obligations. So I have an obligation not to take bread from the grocery store without permission, and another to tell the truth. Both sorts of obligations can be overridden in special circumstances by other obligations. In the first place, perhaps an obligation to feed my starving children, and in the second, when the Nazis are pounding on the door, an obligation to protect a human life. So we must distinguish prima facie duties or obligations from all things considered or on balance. Ultima facie, he says, maybe could be the term, obligations. I have a prima facie obligation to tell the truth. That just means on the face of it, right? In a given situation. Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, okay. In a given situation. However, that obligation may be overridden by others, so that my duty, all things considered, is to tell a lie. This is the grain of truth contained in situation ethics and the ill-named new morality. And prima facie intellectual obligations, like obligations of other sorts, can conflict. Perhaps I have a prima facie obligation to believe. It reminds me of a quote by Nietzsche that one virtue is more of a virtue than two, for they quarrel with each other. Anyway, perhaps I have a prima facie obligation to believe what seems to me self-evident and what seems to me to follow self-evidently from what seems to me self-evident. But what if, as in the Russell paradoxes, something that seems self-evidently false apparently follows self-evidently from what seems self-evidently true? Here, prima facie intellectual obligations conflict, and no matter what I do, I will violate a prima facie obligation. Another example, in reporting the Grand Teton rappel, I neglected to mention the violent electrical thunderstorm coming in from the southwest. To escape it, we must get off in a hurry, so that I have a prima facie obligation to inspect the anchor point carefully, but another to set up the rappel rapidly, which means I cannot spend a lot of time inspecting the anchor point. Thus, lightly armed, suppose we return to the evidentialist objector. Does he mean to hold that the theist without evidence is violating some intellectual obligation? Okay, so just as a guiding point for where I think this is going. Imagine someone saying, I only make decisions based on sufficient evidence. That person can never get married, right? Like, by definition, people are too complicated to have sufficient evidence to know. There are certain decisions you have to make in life that require you to move forward. They require faith. So he's saying, look, of course, I should be sure that the anchor point is secure before we start rappelling down. How can I be sure? Well, I could spend a week. I could hire some helicopters to come in with physicists and we could really make sure. But there's a storm coming. We've got to make a decision. We got to move. We either got to dig into the snow up here where we're less likely to survive, or we got to get down to a safer place, and we got to do it quickly. So I still have an obligation to make sure it's secure, but I don't have 10 hours to make sure it's secure. I don't have 2 weeks to make sure it's secure. I don't even have 20 minutes maybe. I better be careful, and I still have a duty to be sure, or to have some evidence, or to not be lazy about it. But that's not the whole story. Okay. Thus, lightly armed, suppose we return to the evidentialist objector. Does he mean to hold that the theist without evidence is violating some intellectual obligation? If so, which one? Does he claim, for example, that the theist is violating all things considered intellectual obligations and thus believing? Perhaps he thinks anyone who believes in God without evidence is violating his all things considered intellectual duty. This, however, seems unduly harsh. What about the 14-year-old theist brought up to believe in God in a community where everyone believes? This 14-year-old theist, we may suppose, does not believe in God on the basis of evidence. He has never heard of the cosmological, teleological, or ontological arguments. In fact, no one has ever presented him with any evidence at all. And although he has often been told about God, he does not take that testimony as evidence. He does not reason thus. Everyone around here says God loves us and cares for us. Most of what everyone around here says is true, so probably that is true. He's not thinking any of such thing. Instead, he simply believes what he is taught. He is violating. Is he violating an all things considered intellectual duty? Surely not, says Plantinga. And what about the mature theist, Thomas Aquinas, let us say, who thinks he does have adequate evidence? Let us suppose he is wrong. Let us suppose all of his arguments are failures. Nevertheless, he has reflected long, hard, and conscientiously on the matter and thinks he does have adequate evidence. Shall we suppose he is violating an all things considered intellectual duty here? I should think not. So construed, the objector's contention is totally implausible. Well, obviously, but their real contention he's probably going to deal with next. Right. So what the evidentialist objector would say is, well, if Thomas Aquinas were here, we could show him how his arguments are wrong, and then he would have a duty not to believe. But he's obviously not being unreasonable. He's thought a lot about it. He's got a good argument. I can see why it's convincing to him, even if the argument was wrong, right? Perhaps then the objector is to be understood as claiming that there is a prima facie intellectual duty not to believe in God without evidence. This duty can be overridden by circumstances, of course, but there is a prima facie obligation to believe propositions of this sort only on the basis of evidence. That's what he thinks they must think. The theist without evidence, he adds, is flouting his obligation and is therefore not living up to his intellectual obligations. But here too, there are problems. The suggestion is that I now have the prima facie duty to comply with the following command: either have evidence or do not believe. But this may be a command I cannot obey. I may not know of any way to acquire evidence for this proposition. And of course, if the objector is right, there is no adequate evidence for it. But it is also not within my power to refrain from believing this proposition. My beliefs are not, for the most part, directly within my control. If you order me now, for example, to cease believing that the earth is very old, there is no way I can comply with your order. But in the same way, it is not now within my power to cease believing in God now. So this alleged prima facie duty is one such that it is not within my power to comply with. But how can I have a duty, prima facie or otherwise, to do what is not within my power to do? This is an old philosophical principle that ought implies can. You can't tell somebody they ought to do something they're not capable of doing. You have no moral duty to fly and rescue someone falling from a cliff because you don't have the ability to fly, right? So he's saying, how can you tell me it's my duty not to believe something I can't help but believe? Okay. Part 4. So he hasn't given us his argument yet, but he's setting the stage and he's putting a lot of seeds here. He's saying, what if there's no evidence against God's existence and no evidence for it, and we can't settle the question? Do I really have an obligation to not believe in God? What if I can't not believe? What if it's incumbent upon me to make a decision and I see no other way forward? Like, this could be a very interesting kind of a question where, again, he's not arguing for God's existence or against it. He's arguing whether or not it's rational to believe in God, even without evidence, right? And this matters to us in this section because we're trying to see the conflict or cooperation or the integration or the coexistence or incompatibility of faith and reason before we get into other ethical or other philosophical questions about the divine. Okay, section 4. Can I have intellectual obligations if my beliefs are not within my control? This is a difficult and vexing question. The suggestion here is that I cannot now have a prima facie obligation to comply with a command which is not within my power to obey. Since what I believe is not normally within my power, I cannot have an obligation to believe a certain proposition or to refrain from believing it. But then, contra the objector, I do not have an obligation to refrain from believing in God if I have no evidence. This response to the objector is, I think, inadequate, right? So again, he's not giving us his argument yet. He's just testing the waters and saying, how do we think through all of this? He says, what if somebody said, I can't help but believe? He goes, I don't think that's good enough. In the first place, the response is unbecoming of the theist, since many of those who believe in God follow St. Paul, for example, Romans 1, in holding that under certain circumstances, failure to believe in God is culpable. All right? Interesting. He says, well, turn that, if you think you can say, well, I can't help but believe, so it must be a rational thing to do. He says, no, wait a minute. Most of you religious people think that there's enough evidence for God's existence that not believing in him makes you guilty. How can you say that to someone like Bertrand Russell, who says, Lord, you didn't give us enough evidence, right? I would have believed, but I couldn't make myself because there wasn't enough evidence, right? He goes, now, wait a minute. Hold on a second. This isn't going to work. Okay. For you, at least, he's saying you probably don't want to. So in holding, all right. So, and there are cases which most of us, theist and non-theist alike, do in fact believe that a person is culpable or condemnable for holding a given belief, as well as cases where we hold a person responsible for not accepting certain beliefs. Consider the following. Suppose someone comes to believe that Jews are inferior in some important way to Gentiles. Suppose he goes on to conclude that Jews should not be permitted to share public facilities such as restaurants and hotels with the rest of us. Further reflection leads him to the view that they should not be provided with the protection of law, and that the rest of us have a right to expropriate their property if that is convenient. Finally, he concludes that they ought to be eliminated in order to preserve the purity of the alleged Aryan race. After soul-searching inquiry, he apparently believes, in all honesty, that it is his duty to do what he can to see that this view is put into practice. A convincing sort. He gets the rest of us to see things his way. We join him in his pogroms, and his policy succeeds, right? So earlier he was saying, what about a 14-year-old who's just raised to believe this? I mean, it's not unreasonable. He goes, okay, what about a 14-year-old who's like, there's certain beliefs that you're not allowed to have without guilt, right? So he's really being honest about this and trying to figure out what to do. So we'll see where he goes. Now, many of us will agree that such a person is culpable and guilty, but wherein does his guilt consist? Not presumably in doing what he believes he ought to do, in trying to carry out his duty as he sees it. Suppose, to vary the example, he tries to encourage and institute these abhorrent policies at considerable cost to himself. He loses his job, his friends turn their backs on him, he is finally arrested and thrown into prison. Nonetheless, he valiantly persists. Does he not deserve moral credit for doing what he sees as his duty? His guilt surely does not consist solely in his taking the actions he takes. At least part of the guilt lies in accepting these abhorrent views. If he had not acted on his beliefs, out of fear of the consequences perhaps, would he not have been guilty nonetheless? He would not have caused as much trouble, but would he not have been guilty of some sort of a sin, right? Not right? I should think so. We do, in fact, sometimes think that a person is guilty, has violated norms or obligations by virtue of the beliefs he holds. So you can't get out of it by saying, I can't help it, I just believe in God. That's not going to be good enough. The theist, accordingly, should not reply to the evidentialist objector by claiming that since our beliefs are not within our control, we cannot have a prima facie duty to refrain from believing certain propositions. But there is a second reason why this response to the evidentialist is inadequate. I have been using the terms accept and believe interchangeably, but in fact, there is an important distinction that can nicely be used to mark. This distinction is extremely hard to make clear, but nonetheless, I think important. Perhaps we can make an initial stab at it as follows. Consider a Christian beset by doubts. He has a hard time believing certain crucial Christian claims. Perhaps the teaching that God was in Christ, reconciling the world to himself. Upon calling that belief to mind, he finds it cold, lifeless, without warmth or attractiveness. Nonetheless, he is committed to this belief. It is his position. If you ask him what he thinks about it, he will unhesitatingly endorse it. He has, so to speak, thrown in his lot with it. Let us say that he accepts this proposition, even though when he is assailed by doubt, he may fail to believe it. At any rate, explicitly, to any appreciable degree. His commitment to this proposition may be much stronger than his explicit and occurrent belief in it. So these two, that is, acceptance and belief, must be distinguished. Take another example. Oh, what happened there? Take another example. A person may accept the proposition that alleged moral distinctions are unreal, and our tendency to make them is a confused and superstitious remnant of the infancy of our race, while nonetheless sometimes finding himself compelled to believe, for example, that gross injustice is wicked. Such a person adopts as his position the proposition that moral distinctions are unreal, and he accepts that proposition. But at certain times and in certain conditions, he cannot help believing, malgré lui, that such distinctions are not unreal. Let's look that up. I don't know what that Latin or whatever French term is. It's probably a Latin legal term. Let's look this up. In spite of himself, it's French, the etymology. It's probably a legal term. Let's see. Malgré lui, someone who speaks French, laugh at my pronunciation. In spite of himself or herself. Oh, come on. Oh, well, we've got the Oxford English Dictionary over here. We can look that up at another time. That's what those 20 volumes are over there. So we'll look it up later. All right. So in any event, So imagine a person who believes, moral distinctions are all fake. We made them up. They're just an illusion, blah, blah, blah. But then he sees a horrible injustice. He goes, that's wrong. That's wicked. So he accepts a belief, but he can't help believing the opposite sometimes. Okay. Such a person adopts as his position the proposition that moral distinctions are unreal, and he accepts that proposition. But at certain times and in certain conditions, he cannot help believing, malgré lui, that such distinctions are not unreal. In the same way, someone with solipsistic inclination, acquired perhaps by an incautious reading of Hume, could accept the proposition that, say, there really is no external world, no houses, horses, trucks, or trees, but find himself under certain conditions regularly believing that there are such things. Now, I am quite aware that I have not been able to make this distinction between acceptance and belief wholly clear. I think there is such a distinction in the neighborhood, however, and I believe it is important. It is furthermore one of the objector may be able to make use of. For while it is plausible to hold that what I believe is not within my direct control, it is plausible to suppose that what I accept is and can be, at least in part, a matter of deliberate decision, a matter of voluntarily taking up a certain position. But then the objector can perhaps restate his objection in terms of acceptance. Perhaps because of an unfortunate upbringing, let us say, I cannot refrain from believing in God. All right, so I'm going to pause really quickly. This is really fun to read, and it's really long. We sometimes look at the qualities of the different reasoners and the way they argue. I would say one of Plantinga's virtues, one of his intellectual virtues that's really salient, is he's arguing with himself continually. He has like 8 different voices from 8 different positions, right? It makes his argument and his reasoning process really fun to follow and worthwhile following, but also probably quite valuable, for himself. I mean, that's, I guess, what I mean by worthwhile following. But he's coming up with ideas and then coming up with responses to them and then realizing the truth of those and then coming up with, he's arguing everybody's side. Look, everybody does this because they're responding to other arguments when they're writing their essays, but it seems evident, it seems saliently a part of the way he actually thinks, and it's quite enjoyable. But it's also going to make for a long read, and it's good if you're looking for, wait a minute, the last sentence, that must be what he thinks. He's on a journey to figure out what he thinks by addressing all truths that might contradict any direction he goes on this path. So let's keep reading. He's quite fun to read, I think. But then the objector can perhaps restate his objection in terms of acceptance. Perhaps because of an unfortunate upbringing, let us say, I cannot refrain from believing in God. Nevertheless, it is within my power, say the evidentialist objector, to refuse to accept that proposition. And now his claim that there are duties with respect to our beliefs may be reconstrued as the claim that we have prima facie duties with respect to our acceptances. One of these duties being not to accept such a proposition as there is such a person as God in the absence of evidence. Finally, while we may perhaps agree that what I believe is not directly within my control, some of my beliefs are indirectly within my control, at least in part. First, what I accept as a long-term influence upon what I believe. What I accept has an influence on what I believe long term. If I refuse to accept belief in God, and if I try to ignore or suppress my tendency to believe, then perhaps eventually I will no longer believe. And as Pascal pointed out, there are other ways to influence one's belief. Pascal, who wrote his Pensées, addressing it to those who say they are so made that they cannot believe, right? He's the one who came up with Pascal's wager and everything. So we'll have a chance to look at him at some point too. Presumably, then, the evidentialist objector could hold that it is my prima facie duty not to accept belief in God without evidence and to do what I can to bring it about that I no longer believe, although it is not within my power now to cease believing. Now, there may be a series of actions such that I can now take the first, and after taking the first, we'll be able to take the second, and so on. And after taking the whole series of actions, I will no longer believe in God. Perhaps the objector thinks it is my prima facie duty to undertake whatever sort of regimen will, at some time in the future, result in my not believing without evidence. Perhaps I should attend a Universalist Unitarian church, for example, and consort with members of the Rationalist Society of America. 2 interesting institutions. Perhaps I should read a lot of Voltaire and Bertrand Russell and Thomas Paine, eschewing St. Augustine and C.S. Lewis, and of course the Bible. Even if I cannot now stop believing without evidence, perhaps there are other actions I can take, such that if I were to take them, then at some time in the future, I will not be in this deplorable condition. What condition? Of believing something without evidence. So far, then, and again, he's presuming that there is no evidence, that it doesn't work, and that it wouldn't be reasonable to. He's saying let's say there's no evidence, there's no sufficient evidence for believing God, and no sufficient evidence for saying God doesn't exist, and I can't help but believe. And these people are telling me I have a duty not to believe something, that the burden is there, right? He's saying, okay, so I can't get out of it by just saying I can't help but believe. And here's why. Okay. So far, then, we have been construing the evidentialist objector as holding that the theist without sufficient evidence, evidence in the sense of other propositions that prove or make probable or support the existence of God, is violating a prima facie intellectual obligation of some sort. As we have seen, the fact that belief is not within direct control may give him pause. He is not, however, without plausible replies. But the fact is, there is a quite different way of construing the evidentialist objection. The objector need not hold that the theist without evidence is violating or has violated some duty prima facie, ultima facie, or otherwise. Consider someone who believes that Venus is smaller than Mercury, not because he has evidence, but because he read it in a comic book and always believes everything he reads. Or consider someone who holds this belief on the basis of an outrageously bad argument. Perhaps there is no obligation he has failed to meet. Nevertheless, his intellectual condition is defective in some way, or perhaps alternatively, there is a commonly achieved excellence he fails to display. Perhaps he is like someone who is easily gulled, or has a serious astigmatism, or is unduly clumsy. And perhaps the evidentialist objection is to be understood not as the claim that the theist without evidence has failed to meet some obligation, but that he suffers from a certain sort of intellectual deficiency. If this is the objector's view, then his proper attitude toward the theist would be one of sympathy rather than censure. But of course, the crucial question here is this. You see how much he is clearly in Plantinga's mind, there is the evidentialist objector. Look, we're going to talk about the subject here, but let's just zoom out a minute and talk about ways of thinking and the intellectual virtues that are on display here. There are other intellectual virtues, right? We're not doing this at the cost of the other people we've been reading. They've had other ones that we've highlighted and noticed. But the intellectual virtue of he lives, you don't even really have to come up to him with objections. He lives with a version of that objector in his mind, and he's imagining the responses that personage is going to have to his initial, well, I can't help but believe that's not good enough, and here's why. And he goes, oh, wow, that's true, right? He's really having these arguments in his head. That's what thinking is called. You're not yet thinking unless you can make both cases. You're not yet thinking unless you could at least pretend to take up the other case. That's how you think. You think by arguing against positions in your head. You have to allow to emerge ways of thinking and then adjudicate between them. There should be conversations in your head. You can have them with other people too. That's a valuable thing to do. Find people who challenge what you think and give you reason to question what you think so that you can sophisticate your views or maybe revise them and change them. But the thinking person, I think, often or almost always is doing something like what's clearly on display here with Plantinga, I think. I shouldn't say clearly. What I suspect is going on in his mind. It seems pretty evident. Okay. But of course, the crucial question here is this. Why does the objector think these things? Why does he think there's a prima facie obligation to try not to believe in God without evidence? Or why does he think that to do so is to be in a deplorable condition? What's this argument based in? Why is it not permissible and quite satisfactory to believe in God without any evidence, proof, or argument at all? Presumably, the objector does not mean to suggest that no propositions can be believed or accepted without evidence. For if you have evidence for every proposition you believe, then granted certain plausible assumptions about the formal properties of the evidence relation, you will believe infinitely many propositions. And no one has time these busy days for that. So, presumably, some propositions can properly be believed and accepted without evidence. Well, why not belief in God? Why is it not entirely acceptable, desirable, right, proper, and rational to accept belief in God without any argument or evidence whatever? He hasn't answered that question. He's just saying, isn't that a possibility? He hasn't really even given an argument that that's true or accurate. He's just saying, and again, he's not arguing for God's existence here or against it. He's arguing for the rationality that you've not violated a rule of reason or exhibited yourself to be a moron if you believe in God without evidence, because it might be the type of proposition that doesn't need evidence, but he hasn't even made that case yet. He's just going through the way he thinks about the evidentialist here, and it seems to emerge as still an open possibility there. Now he's going to move to his second thread of thought, Aquinas and foundationalism. So he just sort of gave, he keeps doing this quite cleverly. He's a very impressive intellect. Another thing that you can detect in what he's doing is an idea emerges at the end of what he's talking about in a section, and that becomes the entire subject of the next section. He's done that quite a few times now, just in our reading today. So he says, okay, so what's this foundationalism point of his, right? What is this whole idea? He says, well, look, if it's not right to believe things without evidence and argument, then you believe an infinite number of things, right? Whatever you argued from to get to your other beliefs to show that they were supported, those were ideas that you could have proven first and had evidence for. And if you did, they're grounded in other things that you need evidence for, and that can't go back forever. What are you going to do? Just have no beliefs and have no thoughts? No, there have to be some propositions that are at the grounding of everything, he thinks, maybe, unless, of course, the relationship between, as he says, and he'll probably talk about this, evidence and the evidence relation of formal properties, unless we're wrong about that, right? Quine has this idea of a network. There's nothing at the bottom. It's just a spatial network of nodes that rely on each other and things like that. But he's saying, but most people think of it as like, look, I'm building an argument based off of a more solid idea, based off of, and I start somewhere, right? It's like, okay, if I'm going to argue that vanilla is better than chocolate, okay, I could start with the proposition matter exists, right? I could start there and build up and eventually make my argument. But okay, I could argue that matter exists first. I don't have to accept that, but I have to accept something. Whatever I'm using to argue that matter exists, I have to, at some point I have to stop, because as he says, there's no time these days for infinite arguments about everything. Okay. So he's going to put that aside now. And through his train of thought about trying to work out what is the strength and weakness and what's open to us after the evidentialists object to us, he's put that aside. Now he's going to deal with Aquinas and foundationalism, which was his other thread of thought. He called it the other stream that comes together to make his eventual argument. He says, there's something wrong, I think, with all these positive arguments for God's existence from Aquinas, I think. And he's going to try to deal with them here. So let's see. In this section, I shall give what I take to be the evidentialist objector's answer to these questions. I shall argue that his answer is not in the least compelling, and that the prospects of his project are not bright. But it is not only evidentialist objectors that have thought theists need evidence for their belief, if their belief is to be rational. Many Christians have thought so too. In particular, many Christian thinkers in the tradition of natural theology have thought so. Thomas Aquinas, of course, is the natural theologian par excellence. Thomist thought is also, as it seems to me, the natural starting point for philosophical reflection on these topics. We'll be reading a lot of Thomas Aquinas later. Protestant, as well as Catholic. No doubt, there are mountains between Rome and Geneva. Nevertheless, Protestants should in these matters be what Ralph McInerney calls peeping Thomas. At any rate, they should begin as peeping Thomas. We must therefore look at some of Aquinas' views on these matters. So high praise for the Catholic theologian and philosopher from this Calvinist, I think is what he is. I don't know. A, Aquinas and evidentialism. Aquinas on knowledge. 1. So we're obviously not going to get through even half of this by the time we're done, but let's at least, I think we should at least dive into this next section. How much? We've been here a while. All right, we're either I'm going to do this. I can't pause the recording or the live stream. Send me a private chat, Savad. Here's the vote. Are we going to turn this Plantinga essay into 4 readings, or are we going to try to make it 3? Are we going to let it be 5 or 6, or are we going to try to make it 3 or 4? Because this is going to be pretty long. It's worth reading for sure. And then we're going to read essays showing how belief in God is not properly basic, and we're going to have responses here. But I don't think it's accidental that the author put this together. So if you leave a comment in the private there, we're either going to stop here and, we could do all of Thomas Aquinas next time and then go into part 3, the Reformed Objection to Natural Theology. And then part 4, we could probably, all right, so we could get this done. We did 1, 2, it took us 2 just to get through evidentialism, but that was a bit longer. We can do 2 more readings on this. And then we're definitely we're going to have to do a 3rd reading. All right. So let's stop there. Let's stop there and say, we're going to end the live stream. We're going to go have our private conversation in the unrecorded version. We finally got through part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4. They're all coming up. So we're going to have at least 2 or 3 more readings to get through this. But he's got a lot to say, and he's also doing a fair job of setting the landscape of all the other positions that people can have on this at the same time. He's really doing that quite a lot. If you watch last video, he's listing out all sorts of other ways of thinking, but from theistic and atheistic positions, even if those aren't the ones he wants to address. And then he's really quite good on all of this and thinking at the same time. Often there are academic philosophers that I call the stamp collectors of philosophy. They can tell you the 12 points of Descartes' argument, like what's the 4th premise of Descartes' argument in the 3rd meditation for the existence of God, but none of the words mean anything to them. Plantinga here, Alvin Plantinga, is quite impressive, and we're going to see more of him later, and in some of your William James studies and stuff, he's going to pop up. But he seems to have the best of both worlds. He's he's like, even when he's not addressing things, he's giving a whole paragraph of lip service recognition to, well, there's another way of thinking here. I'm going to focus on this and see what this leads to, because that's what I need to do here. But there's another way, and here's another way, and here's some other people who think this way. You could almost get an entire anthology, like a good a pointed bibliography of where else to go in intellectual space by reading this. And at the same time, the ideas obviously mean something to him, and he's living out his wrestling with them at the same time. It's really quite impressive. So because of that, we're not going to go too quickly through it, and we're going to start with his look at Aquinas and evidentialism next. And then we'll probably have to break this up into, typically we get through an entire reading in one session, and this is our 2nd session on Plantinga, but it'll be worth going through it more slowly, and I'll make some more slides on it all. So good. So we're going to end the recording now. We're going to go have our conversation about this and what we talked about last time in this essay. And we'll see you all next week on Friday to continue philosophy of religion. On Thursdays, we're doing philosophy of mind, and we've just gotten really into behaviorism, and then we'll get into functionalism, and that's starting to take off. So it's a good time to join that. On Tuesdays, we're doing the backbone course of all of this. These 2 classes are year 1 material. On Tuesdays, we're doing like intro bits, getting a taste of 8 different sections of philosophy. We're in the a priori section right now, and the nature of knowledge there. So we'll be continuing that on Tuesday. The old videos are out if you want to look at the other sections we did. On Monday, we're doing some year 2 stuff. We're reading Plato's Dialogues. We're reading all of Plato. We're reading it out, and we're kind of doing we're taking more time with Plato than we do with just these cherry-picked year 1 things that we're doing here. There's some exciting news coming up on the 22nd. We will be reading Ion, where Socrates has a conversation about the nature of inspiration and art and revelation, and he has it with an artist, and we have 2 professional artists who are going to be interviewed. We are going to be looking at paintings from one of them. We will be listening to songs or looking at lyrics from an album that's about to be released by another one of them, and there's going to be a lot to it. So the Plato dialogues have been really fun, and we're doing those on Monday. On Wednesday, we are reading The 1001 Nights, an epic work of Muslim and Arab heritage and culture. And we're 4 readings into that. And while we're reading that, we're doing a study of the 1001 Nights that includes other books inspired by it and making references to it and allusions and are related to it in content or in reference. And so we just finished the 4th chapter of 2 years, 8 months, and 28 nights, Sir Salman Rushdie's excellent novel that came out not that long ago. It's a really great novel. I've read it a lot of times. So we're reading that, and that's what we're doing. It's our only literature, our only non-philosophy core curriculum class that we're doing right now. And it's really worth doing. And it's been a lot of fun. And then on Saturdays, for an hour and a half, it's the only one that we definitely cut to the exact time. We are doing some of our year 3 philosophy material, and we're looking through the content, through the context of Nietzsche's Lens and Hammer. Our backbone course there is going through Zarathustra line by line and decoding it, which we've done before in an unrecorded version. We'll be doing again in a recorded version before too long. But to accompany that, like the Plato class accompanies the backbone of year 2, which is done in a different style. To accompany that, we're looking at thinkers influenced by Nietzsche, children of Nietzsche, twins of Nietzsche, other existentialists and pragmatists, William James and Kierkegaard. And on Saturdays, we're doing our deep dive class into Jordan Peterson. I think we're on class 11, 12, 13, and we're only into the 2nd video of his psychological significance of the biblical stories. So years 3 stuff is quite serious. And we're doing that on Saturdays. So that's our full schedule right now. We might be able to open up the schedule for more soon. But that's what's going on. So we'll see you all later, and let's go talk about Plantinga some more, Savad. There's some good things that are related to all of your personal studies regarding the stuff you know about. So let's end the recording now.